This morning, we tried to look at the four gospel glimpses of God in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And I didn't get finished, but I did have the good sense to quit when time was up. So for that, we can all be thankful. In the book of Revelation, before the throne of God, there is four living creatures. They have the faces of a lion, an ox, a human being, a man, and an eagle. And it is amazing how fitting these images are as not only representatives of all created life, but also the four gospel messages that God, through His Spirit, inspired Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to write to all humanity. We look briefly at Matthew and his royal gospel, written to a very narrow audience, the Jews. But they got to go first because they had been faithful for the longest, waiting for the promises to be fulfilled. And that's the key word in the Gospel of Matthew. And something we didn't note, but Matthew really largely looks back. It's out of the past. All of the longing of all the ages, all of the faith in the promises of God, it's all fulfilled by Jesus on the pages of the Gospel of Matthew. But then we come to the book of Mark, an action-packed, moving picture that's really Peter's preaching as recollected and written down by the young man John Mark. And it is so powerful in its impact. The motion that we see Jesus is always in action, and it's always straightway or immediately He is going in the historic present tense. And He's always doing, and His hands are always touching, and He's always helping and healing, and He's the suffering servant who came not to be served, but to serve and to give His life a ransom for many. The key verse in Mark chapter 10, verse 45. Written about the present, as if Jesus is right here before us, before our very eyes. And it's written to a larger audience, to the Romans, the people who were in power and in the empire of that day. Well, how do you follow those two acts, as it were? You follow it with a book that is to an even larger audience, to the Greco-Roman world, a culture. The Greek language had been spread by Alexander the Great across the entire known world, everywhere except China. And he might have been sent there as well. But bottom line, everyone could speak Greek. Everyone knew of Greek philosophy and the Greek longing for the perfection of man. That was their ideal. And to that audience, Luke, the beloved physician, the companion of Paul on a number of his missionary journeys, the best writer in the New Testament, Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man, Luke 19:10, who came to seek and to save that which was lost. The word save and Savior is the key word in the Gospel of Luke. And there's something, everything about the Gospel of Luke is beautiful. It was called by the French skeptic, a man by the name of Renan, who didn't believe in God or didn't believe in Jesus, but Renan said that the Gospel of Luke is the most beautiful book in the world. It tells the story of the most beautiful person who ever lived. And would to God that Renan could have found faith in him. But that's what the fourth gospel is all about, and we'll get there in just a minute. But I can't pass over the Gospel of Luke without touching on some things. And maybe in your own study, you can go and look at it again with fresh eyes and appreciate it just a little bit more. The Gospel of Luke has many beautiful vignettes about people and episodes that we wouldn't know of from any other literature in the world except for this Gospel of Luke. Material not found in Luke include the parables of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. Brother Burton Kaufman in his commentaries said that there have been more hospitals and orphanages and charity institutions founded because of these two stories than anything else ever written. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the stories that warm our heart. And if Luke hadn't recorded them, and written them, we would not know of them. But other stories are the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the parable of the rich man who wanted to tear down his barns and build greater, the story of the righteous, self-righteous Pharisee who prayed with himself and actually literally to himself, and the publican beside him who said simply, God be merciful to me, a sinner. There's so many wonderful characters that we know of from Luke, like Zechariah, Elizabeth, Simeon, Anna, Zacchaeus, the wee little man, and Cleopas on the road to Emmaus with the other disciples. If you ever get to go to the land of Israel, there's so many places you'll want to see, so many things that will touch your heart. But if you get an opportunity to do that, and you get to go out on the road to Emmaus and walk on those Roman paved stones there, and think about the fact that this is where Jesus walked with these two disciples, it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And these stories have this artless touch of truth. There's no contrivance to them. They are so natural and just what one would expect. The Gospel of Luke has so many other things we could talk about. It's a beautiful music in the first two chapters. There are the lyrics to 4 different songs there that you could look at. But the Gospel of Luke reaches out to all humanity, and I'll leave it with this emphasize that one point. You're included. You're invited. You're beloved. And you are one of the people that Luke reached out to, that Jesus came to seek and to save. If you'll remember, in the beautiful angelic announcement of Jesus' birth in Luke chapter 2, the good news that was being announced then was for whom? It was for all nations, for all people. And the prophecies that are quoted there are for all flesh. And when Luke has a version of the Great Commission, Jesus says there in Luke 24 that repentance and remission of sins must be preached to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And as one last touch, there's a unique story in the Gospel of Luke about the commission of a group of disciples who went out to tell others about Jesus, to spread the word. It was the 70. There was the limited commission of Jesus' 12 apostles, and then the Great Commission to the 12 apostles and the rest of the disciples. But in Luke, there's also a third commission of the 70, and they go out to preach as far and as wide as they can reach. Why 70? Well, the rabbis had a view that 70 was the number of the languages in the world. That many people, that many dialects. This is a story from Luke chapter 10. Jesus sends out 70 preachers with good news to communicate that the gospel is for all people. Now, we asked this morning about the 4 gospels. Why would there be 4? Why not just one that takes care of everything? Why not 2? One for Jews and one for Gentiles. Well, the world's a more complicated place than that, but God reached to the ends of the earth with His message of His Son Jesus. Starts small with the Jews, gets bigger with the Roman Empire and the Roman people and their culture. Then to the Greco-Roman world, the rest of the world. It reaches out to all humanity with an image of a perfect man. But then finally, one of the early church fathers said that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, having written or recorded the earthly life of Jesus, lastly, John wrote a heavenly or spiritual gospel from the heavens that gave us a different perspective altogether. that is, if you looked at the outline from the material this morning, where we compare the four Gospels, I believe that about 92% there, that last point in the right-hand corner, bottom, 92% of John's material is unique. He skips over so many things that you're so familiar with from the other three, the synoptic Gospels. They're seen together. He skips a lot, and he brings in a lot. And there are a lot of ways to approach what John had to say, but what we ought to do is let John hand us the keys to his Gospel. Now, some of the Gospels start at the very beginning, telling you what they're going to tell you. But John leaves the keys hanging on a hook by the back door, as it were. And in John chapter 20, John says that truly many other signs did Jesus that are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through His name. That's what John is all about. He wants to make sure that you get that message. And so he records 7 signs. The word sign is a word here that could have been miracle or could have been wonder, but it's not those words. It's something amazing, something miraculous, something that drew attention, but it was a sign of a deeper spiritual reality that we needed to know about. The first one says it's the first one. You know what it is? It's water to wine at the wedding feast of Cana in Galilee. Jump quickly with me to the last one. The last one is at a funeral service. We go from joy to great grief. We go from a time of a new beginning to a time of the true new beginning of life, when we see Lazarus called forth from the grave. It's a wonderful progression that we see here. It starts little and lighthearted. The first miracle that Jesus ever did that meant something in terms of who He was and what He was about. At a feast, a party, a celebration, Mary comes to Jesus and asks Him to help out because they've run out of wine. Now, we don't know if this was alcoholic wine that's been cut with water or if it is just sapa, which was like jam. That there's a recipe for it in Josephus's writings where they would reduce grape juice to just a heavy syrup. Then they reconstitute it with warm water. And they could have fresh grape juice anytime they wanted it that way. But the function of a governor of a wedding feast, one of his functions was to make sure that the wine was properly diluted, whatever they were using. But the point here is that Jesus did something that was truly amazing. And at the end of the story, it says that Jesus' disciples believed. That the story, you know the details already. 6 large water pots were there. Jesus said, fill them up to the brim. And then dip some out and take it to the governor. And they did, and it had become wine. And on the outline, you'll note, I've skipped over a couple of portions here. I ought to help you fill them in. That John, lastly, wrote a theological or spiritual gospel that was emphasizing the full deity of Jesus, the true deity of Jesus, more than the other gospel writers. And this we've already talked about, that we're talking about signs that would identify Jesus as the Christ. Well, what is His first sign? What is it demonstrating power over? When you read different commentators, some say it's time because wine gets made instantly. Don't have to wait for the grapes to grow here. Or some say it's quality because this liquid that was water is now a lot more than water. It's been instantly upgraded and improved to grape juice or wine. I think the best way to understand this is in conjunction with the second one. The first sign and the second sign are numbered. John says this was the first sign that Jesus did. The second sign is the healing of a nobleman's son from John chapter 4, where Jesus heals that young man from 20 miles away. He says, your son is healed. Go home. And the nobleman goes home, and the servants are running to meet him on the way home to tell him, your son was healed. And it was when Jesus said he was healed. So it's actually these two signs, number 1 and number 2, the only ones that actually are technically numbered in the gospel. When you think about it, they're both over time and space. The natural order, the space-time continuum, has been interrupted. Someone has come from outside of space and time, and he is interrupting it. He is intervening in it. He is going to demonstrate a power that is from beyond it. And so Jesus demonstrates power over the time and space, natural processes and distance, and he is able to do something that amazes, creates wonder, but also is a sign that God is here. God is at work. Now, it got their attention, and so far they knew that God was in this man. God was working through this man, but they didn't totally know what this man was all about or who he really was. The third sign occurs in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. There's a man laying at the pool in Jerusalem. He'd been laying there, you remember the number of years? 38. 38 years waiting in the waiting room, waiting for the angel, but waiting for more. When the angel came, the people believed the water would ripple, and it was an invisible angel's presence, and the first person to step in the pool would be healed of whatever. And so you can imagine, and it says the pool was surrounded with people that were afflicted with all manner of maladies. Well, this man had been lame for 38 years. He couldn't even get to the pool. He had no one to help him reach out and get his hand or his foot in the water. And Jesus said, do you want to be healed? And then Jesus healed him. And Jesus told a man whose muscles must have atrophied from just inactivity and inability to use them at all, take up your bed and walk. Rise, take up your bed and walk. Now, this was a man who needed somebody else to take him up and put him in the pool, and suddenly he is able to take up his bed and walk. The ravages of time, the disease and the decline and the ultimate descent to death, Jesus is able to suddenly reverse this for this man and make him whole. And it was a sign that God's healing power was present here. Now, when you think about, I look around the room and I see a lot of gray hair. When I first preached here 25 years ago, or 30, my hair was a different color, and I wasn't wearing these. And you know what I'm talking about, don't you? There's a gentleman, a member of the Memorial Church of Christ, who is an inventor, a mechanical engineer, and he just wrote a little book called Evolution Impossible. And he points out a lot of things that just really evolution could not accomplish or would not accomplish. And it's truly an amazing book. I highly recommend it. But one of the things he touched on that got my attention, evolution is supposed to improve us by making us more fit for survival. Well, let me ask you something. Question he asked in the book. Aging is programmed into your DNA. How does that better fit you for survival? Wouldn't it have been better if we'd been programmed just to survive, if you think about it? But we sit around and we grow old and we can't reverse it. And this man sat around that pool for 38 years. And the ravages of time and disease and devolution, if you will, instead of evolution, were occurring. But Jesus could interrupt that, and that was a great sign. The people that were the religious leaders of the day, what was their reaction to this? They accosted him and accused him, of the man, of working on the Sabbath because he was carrying his bedroll with him on Saturday. And it showed where their hearts were. They were all about external orthodoxy, but they had no heart for the children of God and their true needs. If we move on to the other signs, if you go to number 4, power over human need, the deepest human needs, the feeding of the 5,000, John chapter 6. Very famous story. And this is the story that actually marks a huge watershed for Jesus. This is where he performs a miracle in front of a very large crowd of people, for a very large crowd of people who all participated in it and all witnessed it and all thought that it meant something besides what it really meant. Again, I'll reference Brother Burton Kaufman. How many of you knew Brother Burton? Used to preach at Central, built the Manhattan Church in New York City. Used to attend West U with us, and so I grew to know him and love him. He said that the people here that day, when they realized what had just happened, they thought, well, what we have just seen is we've seen the quartermaster problem solved. Our army can now go up against the Roman armies because we've got a guy here who can supply us. And he's an endless source of food. Maybe, what do we know? Maybe even swords and shields. And they thought, this man is going to be our general. He's going to be our David, our Solomon, and lead us back to glory and help us throw off the Romans. And they took him and they tried to make him a king. And Jesus got in a boat and sailed away from them. Went to a synagogue and immediately there preached a sermon on the bread of life. And told them, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And there's no life in you. And they did not understand him at all. And they thought, this is a hard saying. And many turned their backs on him and went away. And Jesus turned around and looked at the apostles at that time, the disciples, and said, will you also desert me? And Peter said one of the wiser things that he said during his lifetime when he said, to whom shall we go? For you have the words of eternal life. He didn't know where Jesus was going to take him, but he knew there was no other place to go. And he was going to go with Jesus. But Jesus performed a miracle here that meant God can satisfy your hunger, your real hunger, the hunger of the heart, the hunger of the soul for life and life eternal. And if you get the picture, the pictures are getting bigger. We start out with Jesus made some wine to drink at a wedding feast. Now he's feeding 5,000 people. And it's apparent that there's no limit. We're not told exactly how the mechanics of the miracle happened, but you can just imagine. They brought Jesus the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and Jesus just blesses them and starts handing them out, handing them out, handing them out. And it never ends. Jesus can meet all of our needs. Now, in John 6, Jesus walks on water. But this is different because the only people see this are his apostles in a little boat. No 5,000 people here. But Jesus has sent his disciples across the lake back towards Capernaum. And how many of you have ever been on a Holy Lands tour? Anybody here been to Israel? Well, you need to go. If you haven't been, you get a chance, go. It's safer inside of Israel than it is inside of Houston. I'm literally telling you the truth. My daughter gets a news update every day. She subscribes to it on her smartphone. You really don't know how many people are murdered every day in Houston. It is a very, very dangerous place. Don't let the fear of dying keep you from going to Israel. And besides, if you've got to leave this planet anyway, is there a better spot to leave from? But if you get to go to the Sea of Galilee, you look at the northwest corner where all these little towns, Capernaum and Bethsaida are. And you see that in the afternoon, there's a gap in the mountains there on the northwest corner of the sea. And the cool air in the afternoon rushes down from that northwest mountainside and rushes out on the water. And Jesus had sent his disciples in that direction. And they were rowing and they were going nowhere. No progress. They just were stuck. They were struggling and that wind was blowing them back and it was scary out there. And then they look, and in the direction that they're looking as they're rowing, trying to get towards home, they see a figure coming towards them, walking on the water. And they think it's a ghost. And these grown men actually go to screaming. They're very frightened. And Jesus comes to them and tells them, don't be afraid. It's me. Gets in the boat. And then this story tells the ending this way. Immediately, they were at the shore. Just like that. This is a story about storms of earthly opposition. These men were about to meet opposition like they couldn't imagine. They knew that the Pharisees were following Jesus around and picking on him. They had no idea that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians were all plotting to kill them all. That's the enemy that was opposing them. And they were going to be also greatly disappointed when they finally had to accept, we're not going to get a physical kingdom and a physical king right now. We're not going to get anybody who's going to throw off the Roman rulers. The physical kingdom is not what Jesus has been talking about. And that is something they've got to embrace and face. And then beyond that, Jesus was going to leave them. They were going to be alone. And they were going to have to go on without him. And it was such a painful prospect, they couldn't even consider it. They wouldn't even let Jesus talk about it. They were going to have these winds of opposition. And Jesus was going to come to them and say, don't be afraid. It's me. I'm with you. And you're going to get where you're going. This is the fifth sign. The sixth sign is a big sign in that John spends a lot of time on sign number 6. It's about the man born blind. And if you read about this, there is a wonderful interaction here between the man who Jesus heals and the authorities who now are beginning their inquisition. They want to know, who did this? How did he do it? Why did he do it? Why did he do it on the Sabbath day? We want you to incriminate this man for us. And the man born blind, if you'll follow this through John chapter 9, it's really interesting. He starts defending Jesus. And he starts building a case. And it gets stronger with each answer. And then at the end, the man says, finally he says, well, no one in the history of the world has ever heard anything like this. A man born blind, healed. And you're telling me that that man is not from God and that I need to disavow him. Who ever heard of a miracle like this? Anybody who would normally hear this kind of story would believe that this man was sent from God. And you know what they did? They excommunicated him. They cast him out. If that is to be understood legally, it really means he couldn't go back to the synagogue or the temple anymore. He wasn't going to get to be a faithful Jew anymore. And so he is out in public, and Jesus has heard what has happened to him, and Jesus goes to him. And the exchange here is really amazing. Look with me at John chapter 9, verse 35, because here we're getting to what John really wants you to get out of this lesson tonight. Jesus has been doing all these signs, but John picked these because they are building a case. And Jesus comes to this man and presses the case, one-on-one. And if you'll think about it, it's the same thing Jesus is asking you. And everyone who ever opens a gospel and finally says, you know, this man is either the Son of God or he's the devil himself. And I don't believe the devil himself said the words that I read here on the Sermon on the Mount. And you start to think, if he's really the Son of God, then I really should obey him. Look at John chapter 9, verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, imagine Jesus going through the crowds, looking for this man again. And he finds him and he says, do you believe in the Son of God? Do you believe there's a Messiah? That's what he's really saying. And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. Then he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus, and in healing this man, opened up his eyes, but that was just the beginning, the physical sight. Then there's the spiritual exchange with the leaders, and this man's heart is opened. First, he thinks, well, they say, who healed you? And he says, the man named Jesus healed me. And they say, well, who is he? He says, well, the man says, he must be a prophet. He's thinking Elisha. And then they said, no, he's probably a demon-possessed man. And he says, no, this man must be from God. And then he meets God. He meets him in Jesus Christ. That's what the sixth sign is, and there's more written about this than everything except one more story, the seventh sign, the raising of Lazarus from the dead. This is the last enemy, death. This is the Satan's greatest victory, his greatest weapon, our greatest fear, our greatest sorrow. And the question is, can Jesus really give us life and life eternal? In the story of Jesus' power over death, Jesus knows that Lazarus is sick, but he doesn't go to him. Finally, he is told Lazarus is dead, and now he comes. And the delay is inexplicable, but Jesus does say for the disciples, I am thankful for your sake that this has happened so that you can see and know the power of God. And he comes to Bethany, and they're Mary and Martha. You remember Mary and Martha, the two sisters? They have different personalities. One is concerned with physical things, and the other is concerned, first of all, with spiritual things. But they both love Jesus. Well, who comes out to meet Jesus first? It's the one who had her say the first time, Martha. She comes out and right off the bat, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I know that he'll be raised again in the resurrection. Jesus has to go find Mary. And Mary says the same thing. I know if you'd been here that he wouldn't have died. But it's in a different tone. One of them is defeated and upset. The other one is angry with God over the fact that death is still our enemy. But Jesus says, I'm going to make this all right. If you'll look with me at the verses, and we'll conclude here. In Luke chapter 11, verse 24, Martha says to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" And she said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." And you know the rest of the story. Jesus is taken to the grave. And there, even though Jesus knew that Lazarus was sick, even though Jesus knew that Lazarus was now dead, even though he knew that he was going to raise him from the dead, and he evidenced that in the prayer that he prayed, where he was not hysterical, he was not overly concerned. He just said, "Lord, I thank you for hearing this prayer, and I know that you're going to give life to Lazarus." But even knowing all that, Jesus wept. He wept. The shortest verse in the Bible, one of the biggest messages, that God, the God of all creation, the Lord of life and death, He loves you enough to cry over you. And He loved you enough to die for you, and then loved you enough to give you new life. He said, "Lazarus, come forth." Lazarus, after 4 days in the grave, comes forth. And Jesus says those wonderful words, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." How do you think Lazarus got out of that grave when he came forth? Do you think he floated? Did he hop? I don't know. But he came forth. And you know how we know he came forth? You know that story's true? Because they killed Jesus of Nazareth for doing it. If that story wasn't true and had not been, that miracle had not been performed, Jesus would not have been crucified, and He would not have had the opportunity Himself to raise from the dead, be raised by God, and to give us all hope of that resurrection. I've run out of time, but the good news is that we will never run out of eternity. God has promised us life and life eternal in His Son Jesus. And if you would believe in Him and obey Him, we urge you to do so. We urge you to make your needs known by coming now while we stand and sing.